I want to introduce you to Bruce. I personally met with Bruce almost a year ago, and when I met with him, I was amazed by his achievements. But more importantly, I was amazed by his humbleness and kindness. His bio is too long for me to share right now, but in summary, Bruce is a visiting scholar at Stanford University's Engineering Department and a CodeX Fellow at Stanford Center for Legal Informatics. Bruce co-founded Stanford's Sustainable Banking Initiative and is creating a GoodBank as a prototype for high transparency, impact-aware commercial banking. He is also giving a sustainable banking speaker series, and we handed out the flyers in the entries. So if you're interested, you can also participate in his class. Bruce has advised Fortune 1000 corporations and federal technology investors, negotiated billions in finance, merger and reorganization transactions, innovated investment strategies for sharing smarter, open data, and now is redesigning banking, its impact and safety. Wall Street lawyer, Hong Kong merchant banker, Silicon Valley mentor, Stanford pioneer, Bruce, Ashoka Fellow, welcome.
Who did he describe? Oh my God, that's scary. Yeah, when you get to this age, you've done a lot of things. And it's not a straight path. In fact, it's a really crooked path. And so when I start these talks normally because people ask, I have a neuromuscular condition called dystonia. And it's not Parkinson's and my head will shake, but I'm a New York, California, and Pennsylvania lawyer. So if I disagree with you, you'll definitely know it. Not subtle. Baruch asked me to talk a little about my journey, so I will, rather than launching into this immediately. As he said, I'm a recovering Wall Street lawyer, a Hong Kong merchant banker, a 9/11 responder, a geospatial technologist, and an Ashoka Fellow. And so all these brains are like fighting it out up there, you know, talking to each other and talking to me. And so I see problem spaces very differently than if I only had one thing that I did my entire career. My personal story is pretty simple, but not worth a documentary. At age 8, at Mayo Clinic, they figured out that I had dystonia. In those days, they thought that they should recommend a lobotomy, which I passed up, thinking that that would not be the smartest idea. And they said, well, you'll live until you're 15, and then we don't know what'll happen. And there are films of me at Mayo Clinic to train doctors in diagnosing this. And so when someone tells you at a young age that you're going to die at a certain age, and you don't die, you have a very healthy narcissism. And you say, geez, I'm still around. What the heck is that about? And I must be here to do something meaningful. And then, you know, I watch the same cops and robbers show that you do and go to law school and practice at a very large law firm in New York called Weil Gotshal, see some of the antics. Oh no, this is being telecast. And it's a great firm. But I find that some of the most meaningful work I'm asked to do is for nonprofits, such as there was this horrible cycle that Salvation Army would get themselves into. In New York City, they'd have over 100 properties, and every year the city of New York would assess taxes that because they're a nonprofit they wouldn't owe, but every year they forgot. So every year it would go into foreclosure for taxes they didn't owe. And so somebody like me in a large law firm like that would have to figure out how to apply for the exemption to get them out of a foreclosure so that people who need a soup kitchen could go to a soup kitchen instead of a vacant building. None of this makes sense. So I got very frustrated that this was an annual waste of everybody's time, including Salvation Army money. And I researched and found that there was an 1860s law that instead of annually permanently exempted social settlement houses from taxes, these kinds of taxes. Problem was I didn't have a dictionary that defined what a social settlement house was. So I had to go and find an 1880s dictionary at the public library in New York. And I found it, and we fit it like a glove. And I applied for this exemption, and suddenly this problem goes away. And that made me feel good that I had been creative as a lawyer, but more importantly as a human being, to solve a problem that made no sense, as problems are often. And then I worked at a Hong Kong merchant bank, as I said, and one day in August, hot August night, the utility in New York City, Con Edison, exploded a steam pipe in Gramercy Park where I live, 20th and 3rd for those who know New York City, and sprayed 220 pounds of asbestos wrapping and killed 3 people, including a young mom in my building. And I thought, holy mackerel, how can the city of New York streets explode every August from steam pipes? And steam is used to cool buildings. I know that's not intuitive, but come to engineering and we'll explain it. And I thought, well, maybe if there had been a composite digital map that showed the workers for the steam pipe company that's repressurizing the pipe and the water crew that let the water come around the pipe when it was so fragile, and maybe this didn't have to happen, this disaster. And I started to talk to New York City, and I said, well, don't you have a good map of what's underneath the streets? Well, part of it's over here in the environmental protection, and part of it's over at fire, and I'm like, oh no, this is way worse than I thought it was going to be. And I thought I'd take a year of my career, and since I came out of a negotiating background, I'd negotiate getting this done. Well, it didn't take a year, it took 10 years. And the commissioner of buildings at the time met with him. His name was Rudy Rinaldi. He said, Bruce, if I do this map of yours, prove to me how much I'm going to save. I'm like, it doesn't make sense what you're doing now. Why are you asking for this proof? You're so... I go off. I'm like, no, I can't say any of that. And it turns out when people are in your face, especially in places like New York, and they're giving you the keys to their kingdom, they're telling you exactly what if you do and bring back the witch's broomstick, you win. So I went to OMB, the city has a budget office, and I asked, how much are you going to spend on digital maps over the next 10 years? And they gave me a number, $537 million. And I figured out it's only $100 million to do the job right once and reuse the map. This is pre-Google Maps. And they said, that's great, Bruce. You've convinced us. This makes a lot of sense. Where are we going to get the $100 million from? I'm like, oh, this is so painful. And I'm like, well, I'm a bond lawyer. One of the things that municipal bond lawyers know how to do is read the Bond Act, especially for cities like New York that have been in fiscal crisis in the 70s, where they are regulated heavily on what they can spend money on. So I read the Bond Act. It's 77 flavors of what you can spend bond money on, capital money on. Another piece of advice to the social entrepreneurs and change agents, cities run 2 budgets. It's sort of like other organizations that we don't mention. One budget is the operating budget. This is constantly in deficit. This is where the taxes go in and the payrolls come out of. The other budget is called the capital budget. This is where the money from bonds that state of California or the city of New York goes before it is spent for projects that last more than 1 year. The, the takeaway is that if you make a project in a city eligible for capital money, you rain money on that project forever. If you rely on operating budget money, you're screwed because you every year have to reappropriate that money. So when I read the Bond Act, I saw that there were 77 things you could spend money on, including tax maps, street maps, map maps. Suddenly the map, the digital map I want to create is in the Bond Act. It's just not written that way. And I convinced the budget office to spend capital money on a digital map of New York City that's delivered 6 months before 9/11. By this time, the feds have found me and have asked me to do for the country what I had done for New York City in terms of financing what they call the NSDI, the National Spatial Data Infrastructure. And this was Gore reinventing government time. And we figured out a way that basically the free data that you and I use in Google Maps could be refreshed through that process. After 9/11, I was at the command center with the mayor's office and others, and I saw an amazing thing. I saw that New Yorkers could be like Californians. They could help instead of sabotage each other. Suddenly, with the biggest disaster anyone had never imagined, and the loss of life, people could behave like human beings in New York City to help each other. And I'm like, holy crap. What if we could have a safe disaster where nobody gets hurt every so often, so as to remind people that they can behave this way? And I thought, well, I'm a bond lawyer, I'm a finance lawyer, I'm a Hong Kong merchant banker, I'm all of these titles, I'm a geospatial geek. What if I created a bond rating or a credit rating for quality of life? I call it sustainable resiliency. And when you do things that add to quality of life, you get a better credit rating. When you threaten the quality of life in your business, your personal activity, etc., you get a worse credit rating. And then I had two choices. Do I want to try to sell a rating to people who won't want to buy it because if it says that they're not doing the right thing, they're not going to pay me, which is in the GSB not a good idea. Or do I want to create a bank and banking system where because people are adding to quality of life, the assets that they are creating, including those businesses and NGOs, et cetera, are constantly having increasing value, such as renewable energy. And it seemed like that was the safer path. So I started to talk in New York about doing that, and all of my friends and allies in New York said, Bruce, this is great. Go hug a tree in Central Park, get it out of your system, come back and make a lot of money. I don't understand. I know you went to California and you think they understand. So I moved here. And I had never heard of cultural creatives until I came here, but they seem to be a higher order species that live here. And we were understanding of each other. And I was legitimated. And then I was legitimated as an Ashoka Fellow. Who knew I was a social entrepreneur all these years? I didn't know. But suddenly I had a title. And there were other crazy people like me who were using business savvy and institutional and technology theory to make changes happen that otherwise had been resisted. Fast forward to a part of the story that's hard to tell, but I think I'll try to tell it. You know, we're living in an age when there's a diversity of opinion about what needs to be done in the world. But that diversity of opinion has taken on all the elements of cannibalism. And there's a cannibalism of virtues that we are involved in right now. I could be championing water rights in Africa, and someone else could champion women's rights in Africa, and someone else could champion whatever. And we would all be right, and we would all be wrong. Because while that would be our passion, or that would be our conditioning, or whatever, we would, by that approach, create monocultures of beliefs that only one of us has to be right. That monoculture system doesn't thrive in nature, and it certainly hasn't thrived in social development. So what I realized, especially after the 9/11 experience at the command center, was you can make no judgments about the worth of people before you absolutely need them. There were people at the command center that had answers that on a given day in New York City would have been so discredited, I can't tell you. And so when we look at the problems in a society, let's take East Palo Alto, these are complex, but they don't have simple, single virtue solutions. So we have to figure out a set of design principles for working together, and that's what I'm going to show you a little bit of now. As you know, I'm sort of substituting for your real guest speaker, so I'm sort of the faux guest speaker. She'll feel better, I hope. And so you're seeing a presentation I gave to our research group in engineering. And they have some background on what I've been working on, so it's not totally, this is going to go a little fast. We're working on this idea of science-based banking. Banking where what bankers know to fund is actually scientifically measurably important, right? Now that doesn't mean only biological or physical sciences, that's all sciences. And we're trying to blend those scientific metrics, the ones that are being taught and pioneered all around this campus, in such a way that a banker can interpret what comes out of that and make a loan that is priced according to that permanent value that is improved on. So let's think in the simplest case about what you do with your bank. Mostly if I asked you what you do with your bank, you say somebody puts the money in, hopefully you do a little, and I take it out. And that's one of the things that happens. There are actually 6 things that happen with your banking. In the short term, you save and you spend. So for the next month or 2, you're working in there. Over the longer term, a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, investing and borrowing. And then in an indefinite or unknown time frame, you're insuring and donating. And they're in the same part of this graph, because if you bought car insurance last year and you didn't make a claim, you actually made a donation to someone who did. And so insurance is a forced form of donating for social purpose. So this is great, except most of the banks that I talk to and that I've looked at keep your identity as a spender, so your credit card, separate from your saver identity, separate from these identities, and they don't even know about these identities. And so when they talk to you about your power as a financial unit, they very much split you apart. So, Larry's right arm is off in the car loan department, and they love him there for that. But his left arm is in the wealth management area, and they know him there. This is not a way to harness your power or aim your power. This is a way for the bank, because it's not set up this way, for you to aim all 6 functions at causes you want. Well, what if we wrap these functions in feedback loops, with the feedbacks you need on using all of these functions to know if what you're doing with your money serves the purposes that you believe in. You've never had money like that. I've never had money like that. We can talk about SRI, socially responsible investing, which is both negatively screened and starting to be a little affirmatively screened. Negative meaning avoid a consequence, no porn, no war, no tobacco. But causing an impact, improving health, reducing poverty, that we don't have a lot of SRI on. ESG, environmental social governance, CSR, corporate social responsibility. These, for the most part, are December year-end reports with dandelions and cute faces of all demographics so as to have you reacquire the brand, right? But they're not tethered to the impact that you experience either as a shareholder or as a consumer. Well, it turns out that if you think about nature, nature is a savings bank. Nature has evolved diversity of species for really good reasons. It needs to sequester carbon in a drought condition and in a flood. And there are two different species that do this. And it's called biomimicry, and if you've seen any of Janine Benyus's talks on TED or otherwise, it's brilliant. When I talked to her, I said, Janine, nature's a savings bank. It's like, of course. So how do we get those principles into our form of banking? If nature can do it, can we? It's a form of biomimicry. So here's our research agenda. And I won't take you through all this, but clearly the banks need to rebuild trust after the 2008 crisis. Driving loyalty, how do we, if everything's on the web and every bank has the same iPhone app, how do they keep you loyal to one bank or another? How do they do that? Tapping science, I've talked to you a bit about the science-based approach to money telling us its story. I'll tell you a little more on that. Could we aim banks as sustainability engines? Could banks be part of our strategy in terms of funding things that matter? You know, we can do Occupy, we can talk about Occupy, we can talk about the bright stage that Occupy lit. We can talk about the lack of solutions that Occupy resulted in. So how do we aim banks as sustainability engines, and how would a banker give a different form of credit to something that was judged sustainable versus not? How do they do that mechanically so they don't get sued? And then how do we make banks safer? There's, I guess, a general impression that the recession we just went through, the global recession, is a once-in-a-lifetime event. Well, the fact is we've had 11 recessions since World War II, some short, some long, some deep, some shallow. We've just gone through a deep, long recession. The problem with recessions for banks is that they test bankers' assumptions of what to extend credit to and why, and what the ballast, what the resiliency of that borrower or that asset is to come back after a recession. So I'll give a little bit of a plug for the seminar. Last spring, we had a whole bunch of wonderful speakers come, and the students said, let's do some more. And this year we have some really great speakers. I guess we'll be serving wine because we have, I'm not sure of that. I hope we are. This is if any of you know Palantir, one of the co-founders, Joe Lonsdale's charity wine business, and it has a dual purpose. They actually are an ethical supply chain. They make great ethical wine, and they donate the net profits to charity. So they're a perfect business case for us to say, if we had a sustainable bank, how would we treat them differently? I have a friend who's the chairman of a French cooperative bank flying in from Paris. We have a lot of great support from Silicon Valley Bank. I'll be with the vice chairman tomorrow for breakfast. This is the bank regulator. The commissioner of banking for California is coming. This is the former commissioner of banking for California. So this is the head of sustainability for the city of Palo Alto, the Center for Compassion Altruism Research, and someone who I'm starting to call the Dumbledore of financial scandal in London. She seems to know she knows more scandals than I've ever seen reported. I mean, her name is Helen Parry, and she's great. So you have the poster. I've done a couple of papers recently that are sort of interesting. This is the technical paper that explains a periodic table I'll get to of quality of life. This is a piece of research for credit unions in this country, and why are they different, and does it matter that they continue? And then the work on curing institutional amnesia in the City of London is about saying that scandals have happened for the last 40 years there, and can we change that? So I'm going to share some Forrest Gump moments. I have these regularly, and because it happens. So you're talking to, or you're listening to a Jewish boy from Philadelphia. I've been to the Vatican twice. I've met with the Archbishops of Canterbury and Westminster, their representatives. I've talked to the UK chief rabbi, the Poland chief rabbi. I find myself with people who care about banking's impacts or what their money is doing. So I arranged for a meeting with the San Francisco Federal Reserve and the Mayor's Office of Innovation in San Francisco in January. And lo and behold, we're talking, and the fellow from the San Francisco Federal Reserve says, well, Bruce, you understand, it's interesting about this sustainable banking. We have $150 billion a year in the United States is required by the banks to put out as Community Reinvestment Act lending. So it's acronym CRA lending. This goes into the poor neighborhoods, and it's basically geographically targeted lending without any metrics for what it's supposed to achieve. Now, anytime you have a lot of money without metrics, whether it's in government or business, not a good idea, right? But 150 billion of that annually, that's a big opportunity space. So, we proposed a project in San Francisco where we would use a periodic table of quality of life to measurably take CRA money and make something happen, something good happen. Then, impacts transparency could be part of civil rights. And the two could go together in a strange way. And I found myself at the Sheraton on El Camino, where Reverend Jesse Jackson is at the next table over breakfast. And I'm talking to someone from Amsterdam about what we're doing, and I excuse myself and introduce myself to Reverend Jackson, and I say, excuse me, I'm Bruce Cahan, I'm at Stanford. And lo and behold, Reverend Jackson pulls his chair over, and for the next half hour, he's sitting with us talking about this. And then I get invited to his preparatory session before he confronted HP on the lack of diversity in the boardroom. Now, why would someone like Reverend Jackson care about banks? Well, we've just lived through the subprime crisis, right? And we've also lived through the lack of funding through mentorship and other reasons of minority startup businesses that can last 5 years. Okay? So what starts as just a discussion about fixing banking very quickly changes into a social discussion. And then a friend of mine is a neurosurgeon, Dr. Jim Doty. He is a co-founder of the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research, along with the Dalai Lama, His Holiness Dalai Lama, and Google's Jolly Good Fellow Ming. And so mindfulness practices, meditation, altruism, compassion. Jim, as a neurosurgeon, found that some of his patients were recovering from neurosurgery at a better rate than others. And he went into this area of why do some teams work better? What is that altruism I told you about at the command center doing to make results happen at lower cost, over time, over difficult challenges? And Jim is an incredible guy. He's about to write his autobiography. I sort of can't wait. And he's held lots of trainings, if you will, here at the GSB about what it means to be mindful and compassionate and to use those instincts to bond with other people and to get them in on your team because they see your vision, but they also see your humanity. And then finally, two things have come up recently. One, I'm part of the UN's group looking at how to finance environmental policy. And there's a group in San Francisco called the SASB. If you know about the FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, you may hear the term Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, GAAP. That's not the genes, that's this other thing. And then there's the GASB, the Government Accounting Standards Board. That's for the non-federal governments. And then the SASB is a supplemental standard that they're looking to create called Sustainable Accounting Principles. Because companies that would demonstrate that should be distinguishable. Let me go back to basic banking theory. Bankers juggle three challenges, and they're safety, profits, and trust. And so if you're the banker today, this is your world. And you take money in from depositors, right? And you owe them safety. You're supposed to put that money into these pieces of paper called investments of different kinds. And those pieces of paper put the money into real assets. And to the extent that we don't really understand and trust bankers, we ask for this set aside of money called reserves. Well, that's all well and good, except you have no idea what the impact of doing this is, right? You're just mechanically doing it, responding to algorithmically traded values that you hope in the marketplace represent true value. So you live on spread, the difference between what the investments generate and the depositors demand that you pay them. And then it gets really messy, like in a recession, because you have to manage assets and foreclose, and you lose money as a banker. So what we figured out, which isn't rocket science, but it turns out to be close to it, is there's an impacts layer for why assets are held and developed. Okay? You don't build a wind farm because you like spinning things in a field. You build a wind farm to generate energy. You buy a farm not because you like to see plants grow, but because of the yield. So those impacts are something that for a bank could be business intelligence that it almost entirely ignores right now. And we think we can package that intelligence so that bankers are more part of the solution than the problem. Trust will go up in bankers as a result, etc. This will get a little dense, but excuse, a bank lawyer for taking you here. I didn't know I would. So there's a group called the Basel Committee that you can read about in the financial press. And the Basel Committee is a committee of all the central bankers in the world. And so the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, you name it, they're in it. And they got together last year and they said, we've made all these rules and changes and they're going to require the banks to hold a different amount of reserves. Let's see if we tell the banks, here's a mythical bank, a financial statement for a bank that doesn't exist, but it looks a lot like the biggest banks you can come up with. Let's see if they come up with the right answer to the amount of reserves we think that they are supposed to hold. Well, they gave this set of numbers to 30 different banks, and they got 30 different answers. Now, this isn't a spot quiz for these banks. This is like the basics of having a safe bank. And it means that the bank that said, well, we have more than enough reserves, holds bonds or other claims in the bank that says, well, we don't have enough reserves. This is a systemic risk profile for the international banking system, showing that they don't know how to do credit risk on their portfolio, which comes back to the impact issue that I told you about, that the banks don't know how to value their assets. That's why I got 30 different answers. So the other problem is that if we wanted banks to be impactful, what would we do? How would we start to even talk to them about this? So imagine that I asked you to write on a piece of paper the 3 most important things you care about in the world. Peace, security, whatever those are, climate change. And we put these up as your personal goals and your group goals. And we get into a debate about healthcare being more important than climate change, more important than energy, more important than, knowledge transfer, et cetera, education. What I think we're coming to is the notion that in my work, that if I want health, I actually have to also invest at a given rate in education, in food security, in other things that are, I'm calling them adjacency or independent, but interdependent. And in this way, it may be cheaper if I have $1,000 to invest in charity or whatever, or stocks that are showing me what they're doing according to this, to achieve my goals by co-investing simultaneously in these clusters of related quality of life elements. So we're starting to build a quality of life table, and this is some of how that's going to be done. I don't want to get too down in the weeds, but we're going to do it using federal budget money, analysis. So you figure the federal budget, 30% of the gross domestic product, it's sort of voting on what should be outcomes in a quality of life table sense. What if we look at the last 10 years of the budget and we see that we've been spending on education, and we look at the next 10 years and we're going to spend a lot on education, and we see that the last 10 years we've had a gap in education by all the metrics that the Washington lobbyist phone book can show me, and we have for the next 10 years gaps. When an engineer looks at this table, folks, it's not like you and I. They see a production function for gaps in education. They do not see a production function for education, which is a key difference. We're spending money to buy a gap in education. somebody comes to the bank and says, well, you know that gap in education you have per capita in California is the 49th worst state on education? I have an NGO or a triple bottom line company or a Khan Academy. I can close that gap faster than you're ever going to be able to. If I know that as a bank, I can price that credit differently because I have depositors who have told me they care about education. So these become very valuable tools for a sustainable bank to use to build a quality of life table. I think I'll stop there just because it gets too much otherwise. And if there's questions or if I put you to sleep, I hope you've had a good nap. It's the end of the day. It's getting to be spring. You're thinking about other stuff. Somebody didn't give you the energy drink, whatever it is. And I thought I'd just open it up to questions, if that's okay. Yeah, anybody? Silent. Yes.
Talked a little about monocultures,
Yes.
and the problems of that, but can you go into that a little more? I don't see how focusing on one area over another harms any of the other areas.
So this will get personal, if that's okay. Okay. Assume for a moment that you or one of your classmates believes that starting women-owned businesses in Africa is a super important thing, right? And you go to philanthropists, such as at 7 o'clock, and they agree with you and you raise a ton of money to start women-owned businesses in Africa. And you are quite successful. Now, the only concern I might have is that there are these other genders and sexual preferences without the funding that you've now provided in economies that are either barter-based or gift-based and are certainly not debt-based, which is what much of this microfinance is. So you have two issues there. One is you're indebting the poor further and thinking that that's progress. And two, you've left out an entire range of actors, leaving, in the case of men, the choice to be making more babies, more war, taking drugs, and committing domestic violence, none of which helps women. So for me, I see diversity and passion, a belief to be incredibly important. I'm not trying to convince you not to do right by women. I'm suggesting to you that you need an objectification, like a quality of life table, to say, okay, the passionate people who believe in this part of the table, go at it. But realize that there's adjacencies to what you're doing that are going to have some impacts either for good or for bad. They may get you there faster. The distribution of the goods produced by a women-owned business in Africa and the distribution channel for men would be likewise impactful. So that's the cannibalism I see as dysfunctional. And monoculture thinking would get you a result that would not exist in nature. Monocultures die in nature, and we see that all the time. So a dominant, and we see that in politics, and we see that in social, we see it all over. But in philanthropy and in social enterprise and in impact investing, monoculture shouldn't be. Is that okay? Did I go too strong? Okay. Yeah.
Actually, I am a central banker from Japan, and my job is to examine and inspect the financial companies, so this topic is really interesting to me. And my question is about the transparency.
Yes.
So in my understanding, the financial companies provided a lot of information to public, and the amount of the risk and the maturity and the quality of the asset to the regulators, usually usually, so they have already provided a bunch of information. So what kind of additional information is necessary to increase the transparency of financial companies?
Great question. So transparency built by reacting to bad news headlines is different from transparency that tells you what the future could be. So far, in much of our financial regulatory environment, we've had transparency that is built on predicting the failures of the past in financial institutions. That's really important to know. It's important to know how resilient to recessionary shock or stress a bank is. What's also important is to know why do its assets retain value or give up value in a recession? And what do you as the regulator or the bank's chief credit risk officer do to have a mix of assets that are both pro-cyclical, meaning they move with if there's an expansionary, a good time in the economy, but also counter-cyclical? And what do you do to hedge that? I'm saying that the transparency that banks could benefit from, clearly what I'm showing you from the Basel stress test, is something that more closely looks at the FVAR, the functional value at risk, not just the VAR, the value at risk, as dictated by the market pricing of those assets. The functional value at risk, will the asset for renewable wind farm hold its value? Well, it'll continue to produce energy independent of the business cycle with some demand qualifications there. How do you do that as a banker? How do you know going in that you've made a loan on Monday that by Friday has made your bank safer? Right now, all those functions in banks are disaggregated, are separate. You don't have a dashboard that helps you with that as a loan officer. I'm thinking that banks need to have a better dashboard for those transparencies. And ultimately, if you give me a second, because I didn't put the deck together, as I said, for you all this way, but I'll show you one slide real fast that'll explain it. So we have the idea of creating what I'm calling semantic or storytelling money. And there. You as a bank are performing a utility function. You're taking this money in from depositors. They're saying, please keep it safe, but also please help us tell the story of being the depositor we are. And we've talked about the different passions one could have as a depositor. And then you're lending the money to Coupa, or you're lending the money to a business or an NGO who also want their money to be safe, but they also, when they borrow this money, would like you to validate that they are the ethical or impactful business positively, because that builds their brand. And it also reduces some of their risk. Well, a bank that would match these stories and then would broadcast that would have a different form of transparency than one that deals in camouflage or opaque money. So this is a different form of digital money, and I'm calling it storytelling because it has this feedback loop of, I gave you the money, bank, what did you do with it? And did what you do with it ratify who I want to be? There's a bumper sticker you've probably seen, let me be the person my dog thinks I am. Let me be the person my bank can help me be. Okay, better, okay, more purposeful, using all of those 6 functions. That's a different form of transparency. We can talk offline if you want about how that changes some of the federal regulatory issues, may ease them in some ways. But at least as a bank and a banker, you're not waiting for the next crisis to tell you a new set of regulations you've got to follow and make transparent about. This is a way to get ahead of that curve. Did that make some sense?
bank has various kind of assets and various kind of deposits, so it's really, how can I say, complicated.
Take the sovereign wealth client, take the high net worth client, take the government client of a bank. Okay, big deposits. Now, take Hewlett Foundation or any mission-focused foundation. They would like their money to be in a bank that's doing, consistent with their mission, more good than harm. I'll digress. I met recently with the chief sustainability officer of a very major data company in the Valley. There's only a choice of 3 of those, so you'll guess 1. I said to this chief sustainability officer in preparing for the meeting, I happen to notice that your company has $35 billion of what's called free cash in short-term investments in banks around the world. 35 with a B, billion. I said, you're the chief sustainability officer. Did you ever think to talk to those banks about what they're doing with your money that are enhancing your chief sustainability goals? He said, I never thought of it. Now, that's a Fortune 100 company not asking the question because the banks have never offered the service, right? So I think it scales. This approach does scale. Yeah.
You talked about banks and the way they value risk.
Yeah.
And I know different industries approach risk with a different analytical perspective.
Yep.
Do you advocate using something more along the lines of engineering risk analysis, or how do you think that process can be fixed?
So they've had their way with me. I love the engineers. They think differently than transactional people, which I consider myself one. They think about really elemental scientific explanations for why things work. They value, there's a group of PhDs over in the engineering school valuing the cooling potential of a tree leaf of a certain species, since Disney is planting 50,000 of them in the new Shanghai theme park, and going to go to a bank to borrow money and would like the bank to recognize the value of the cooling capacity. So risk analysis from engineers, and you know that this is taken hold in Wall Street because why are 240 banks and financial institutions recruiting Stanford engineers last fall? They must get some value out of it, right? Different way of thinking.
Just had a question around whether or not there's kind of envisions a trade-off between the financial return and kind of the high quality of life score.
Yep.
That a bank can get. Obviously, if a depositor, if depositors say that they're interested in, for example, supporting educational causes,
Right.
And the bank then uses that as a kind of guiding force in terms of determining kind of loans or investments. Does that require the bank then to perhaps forego some interest or some sort of expected return, or is it seen as kind of those two things?
So, super question. And there's a group in Europe called the Global Alliance for Banking on Values, GABV. And they looked at the major, what are called SIFI, or systemically important financial institutions. One could colloquially say the TARP recipient banks, too big to fail, versus values-based or smaller community, let's know our customer in a very deep way. And this is a representation of what they found in all of the ways that you as an investor in bank stocks would analyze 2 bank stocks. The values-based banks are doing better through the recessionary period. So is this proof? No. Is this an indicator? Yes. My own research looked at 8,000 US banks over 20 years, and here, and picked out 2 banks that you may know, I don't know, Shore Bank in Chicago and Wainwright in Boston. And looks, forgive the time scale, it didn't transfer, but you know, at the begin, there's a rating that the regulators give banks called CAMELS, or Capital Assets Management, Earning Liquidity, and Systemic Risk. The formula for that is secret, but some of us have guessed what we think it would be or close to it. So this is not the official, you know, disclaimer. Looking at the two banks and having a low score like in golf is a really good thing in the CAMEL score. If you have something above 2, the regulator is knocking on their door and saying, what are you going to do to fix this? You're not as safe as you need to be. So you start the time series with SureBank safer than Wainwright, and you end up with Wainwright safer and SureBank closed. Now, what I haven't told you is that both of these were civil rights era banks. They were both aiming to help people, to do the right thing. One got off their mission and one didn't. So there's still basic banking in doing what I'm proposing, and it's not a guarantee of success, as the question implies, but if you do it right, you make it through a recession. And that's sort of the ultimate test for a safe financial system. Can you get through a recession? And so I don't think you give up yield. When we have, with the help of former Goldman Sachs financial analysts, looked at what I call GoodBank, the IRR is 17%. So that's a very healthy return on a bank that performs this way. Yeah. Yes?
Good morning. About the production equation for gaps in education that you mentioned.
Sure. So the paper that I flashed on for you describes it in gory engineering detail, as they've taught me to write it. But you know, coming back to it, wherever you want to start in building a periodic table of quality of life, do you guys know the history of the periodic table? I mean, I was fascinated. I went back to look at it. The periodic table was the way in the 1700s. They said it was sort of like, I imagine it almost like a coat closet for what we think we know about chemistry. So there were hooks for, this is the element we know we can identify. And there were empty hooks for space where we knew an element existed, but we didn't know how to identify it. 2 social knowledge functions, what you think you know and what you think you don't know, as opposed to the Rumsfeld view of world. And so the periodic table ultimately was something everyone could use to share what they knew and what they wanted to know. So I'm not proposing this as Bruce's periodic table. I'm proposing this as we seem to have spent in our country through the budgeting process for governments a lot of money on things we say we care about, that we go into congressional committees with lots of scary statistics and seem to think we can measure. And what if we put them all next to each other? And again, this comes back from my 9/11 experience, when everybody on 9/12 had these scary metrics that the city was going to fall into the, you know, sinkhole of the earth, because everything was broken and everything was out of kilter. Well, those metrics existed on September 10th. What would we have done it differently to build resiliency if we had known? So the production function is as follows. If I know that I've been spending money for the last 10 years, and I know I'll be spending money for the next 10 years, to produce these outputs called gaps in education, what do I know of the difference between how much I've been spending and how much gap I've been measuring? What does that tell me? Am I spending more to stand still with the same gaps? Are the gaps reducing? That's an effectiveness question. am I spending at a different rate in the education cell than I'm spending in the health cell? Because if there's a balance or a tether or an adjacency between those two cells, people who are sick don't show up to get educated in schools, as your speaker has shown. Not me, the one that I replaced. And so, you know, how do we map these interdependencies? Well, there's no process of government that works this way. Theoretically, the executive office of the president does, but not really. You know, so how do you tell the head of the Committee on Transportation that they're going to do some things that are actually going to help reduce the environmental impact? They're supported by the lobby that builds turnpikes, for God's sake. So how do you have this conversation? Right now, we don't have a tool even to do this. And so what you see is me using the banking system as a Trojan horse to create tools for complexity science, this being one of them. A second tool is, I call it a three-layered map of the world. Why is it that the people with needs, such as in Africa, have to navigate through self-appointed NGOs to get to money? That, in an Internet of Things world, that's sort of a little crazy, right? So what if we had a three-layered map of the world? And the first layer would be needs, and needs expressed in the science and the metrics of this at all scales, city, county, government. Second layer, capacities. I want clean water in Africa. Now, I can either take 20 years, build a water treatment plant, concentrate corruption risk, okay, kill off 3 generations of Africans, and finally somebody someday hopefully drinks clean water. Or I can hand them one of those, you know, filter bottles, and I have a distribution challenge in that. But, you know, they can drink clean water this afternoon. There are 2 capacities for doing exactly the same thing. The third layer, so you have a needs layer, a capacities layer, money layer. In work I've done for the federal government, I know how to mine federal procurement data. It's already tagged. This large bureaucracy does one thing really, really well. It operates on Star Trek impulse power, but when it's done pushing money through itself, it has tagged the money with what it said it was going to do with it. If the federal government has decided that clean water in Africa is worth funding, money layer, then it's worth funding not just for the project sponsors who want the water treatment plant built. It's worth funding for the people who are really thirsty and have the need. So you know, democratizing how meaningful money, how tagged money, how semantic money or storytelling, democratizing how that works is going to take this kind of tool for the adjacencies that I've described, but it will also take the kind of transparency, coming back to the question on transparency, what do we do with all this money? I mean, is it possible that we can only have digital forms of money that are as antiquated as that, as silver dollars? I mean, we have digital money with huge bandwidth, enough bandwidth for Google to figure out how to sell stuff to us. It's got bandwidth, I hope, to tell us what it's been doing while we were sleeping. And that's what part of this advance will take us into. Is that?
Any last question?
Of course. You're the host.
So, I think you persuaded all of us that there's a great need and demand for a sustainable bank, and you've been working on this for a while. So what are the biggest challenges for the sustainable bank to make its first launch?
Great question. This is the ask question. So you guys are too young, but Larry and I will remember a movie, Woody Allen movie called Love and Death. And in this movie, the father walks through the entire movie with a little plot of dirt saying, all I want is a house. And at the end of the movie, he's got a little Monopoly house on this plot of dirt. I want to create a sustainable banking institute here at Stanford. I want to endow it with $30 million to have people actually right above us manage to produce the kind of annual return it takes to employ PhDs and faculty, et cetera. I want that to do some of this work, this science-based research. And then to make sure it's not just PhD theses in PDF form, I want to actually push what we think would work into what I call a teaching hospital bank, or GoodBank. And that bank would be by buying an existing bank. There are many banks that are going to have to be sold. We've gone from 17,000 to 7,000 banks in the United States. In 20 years, we'll go to 4,000 in 10 years, maybe. So there are a lot of banks that need to sell and be used for other purposes, and so we could buy a bank and recapitalize it for $45 million. And teach bankers a new culture. Let them evolve a new culture. Like they come to the GSB to have a network, let them, start to network in this sustainable banking culture with these transparencies, participating in deals that are tagged this way. And so, by best guess, 18 months from the time that $75 million shows up in my inbox, there will be a GoodBank.